You picked the wrong 78-year-old to mess with. That's what my grandfather's weathered eyes said as he fired up his backhoe at 5 a.m., while the HOA enforcement officer's gleaming white SUV sat unattended on our fourth-generation cattle ranch. By 9 a.m., that vehicle was stranded on a tiny dirt island, surrounded by 6 feet of murky water, with Officer Karen screaming into her phone about criminal mischief. 23 days of harassment, $1,750.00 in bogus citations, and one cut water line later, Grandpa finally taught her that Texas property lines aren't just suggestions. Ever had someone with a clipboard act like they own your backyard? Drop your HOA horror story in the comments, and if you're watching from a state where they can't tell the difference between decorative fencing and actual ranch infrastructure, we send our condolences from the Lone Star State. I never planned to move back to my grandfather's ranch. After 12 years climbing the corporate ladder in Dallas, burnout hit me like a freight train. My doctor actually used the words stress-induced cardiac event. I was 34. But it wasn't just health concerns that brought me home. It was the promise I'd made to my grandmother the night before she passed away 5 years ago. "Michael," she'd whispered, holding my hand with surprising strength, "your grandfather won't admit it, but he can't manage the ranch alone much longer. When the time comes, promise me, you'll come home. This land is our legacy, your legacy. Don't let it slip away." 2 weeks after my health scare, I was unpacking my city clothes in my childhood bedroom, breathing air that smelled like hay and cattle instead of exhaust and anxiety. The first month was pure detox. No emails, no meetings, just physical labor that exhausted my body while healing my mind. Grandpa Earl hadn't changed much in those years away. Still woke at 4:30 every morning, still wore the same style of faded Wranglers held up by suspenders, still splashed on Old Spice aftershave that mingled with the earthy scent of fresh-cut hay as we sat on the wraparound porch, discussing the day's work. At 78, the Vietnam veteran and retired civil engineer moved a little slower, but his mind remained sharp as a tack. After Grandma passed, the 300-acre working cattle ranch became his entire world, their shared dream that he refused to surrender. The Stanley Ranch had been in our family for 112 years. My great-grandfather purchased it in 1913, and it weathered 2 world wars, the Dust Bowl, and multiple recessions. The property sits just outside of Clearwater, Texas, or at least it used to be just outside. The city had been crawling closer for years. That crawl became a sprint when Thomas Wellington III purchased the adjacent 1,000 acres. Wellington Development broke ground on Saddleback Estates, a luxury-gated community with homes starting at $750,000, swimming pools, tennis courts, and manicured lawns, where cattle once grazed. "Progress," Grandpa muttered one evening, watching the bulldozers from our fence line. "That's what they call it when they pave paradise." We might have coexisted peacefully if the county hadn't rezoned the surrounding area from agricultural to residential, and if the city hadn't expanded its limits to include not just the new development but also part of our ranch. Suddenly, 6 acres of our property fell under what they called the Western Heritage Overlay District. The irony of using heritage to harass actual heritage farms wasn't lost on us. The distinctive crunch of expensive tires on our gravel driveway announced the arrival of unwelcome visitors. The first time I heard it, I walked out to find a white Ford Explorer with community standards enforcement decals parked near our barn. A woman in her 50s with an immaculate blonde bob, pressed pantsuit, and stiletto heels was measuring our fence with a laser tool. "Excuse me," I called out. "Can I help you with something?" "Marjorie Keller, HOA compliance officer," she said without looking up. "Your fence is 5.2 feet high. The Western Heritage Overlay District Covenant limits decorative fencing to 4 feet. This isn't decorative, it's a working cattle fence on a working cattle ranch." The sharp click, click, click of her heels on our barn's concrete floor echoed as she walked past me without permission. "Not according to city zoning anymore. You're now part of the Saddleback community. Here's your first citation. $250.00 due in 30 days. What followed was a masterclass in petty bureaucracy. Officer Keller, or Officer Karen, as Grandpa started calling her, began daily inspections. Clipboard in hand, camera around neck, measuring tape at the ready. She documented everything: the height of our hay bales, the distance of our equipment from the property line, the direction our cattle shed doors faced. Here's a knowledge nugget worth remembering. Grandfather clauses in Texas property law can exempt long-standing structures from new zoning requirements. Always check if your property qualifies for prior non-conforming use exemptions before making any changes demanded by new authorities. But Officer Keller wasn't interested in grandfather clauses. She was interested in our grandfather's land. She regularly parked on our private road near the cattle loading area, sometimes blocking operations entirely. The whir and click of her camera's shutter followed us everywhere, documenting our home, our equipment, our lives, without consent. "You folks clearly don't understand how things work in civilized communities," she said one afternoon, handing Grandpa 5 new citations. "Your property values are dragging down the entire district. Time to get with the program or face the consequences." Grandpa took the citations with a steady hand, pushing his weathered Stetson back on his head. "Ma'am," he said with deceptive mildness, "my family has raised cattle here since before your grandparents were born. I reckon we know a thing or two about civilization." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "We'll see about that, Mr. Stanley." The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday, thick as a phone book and reeking of expensive perfume. I felt the heavy weight drop onto our kitchen table as Grandpa sliced the envelope open with his pocket knife. Inside was a formal notice claiming HOA jurisdiction over not just the 6 acres the city had annexed, but our entire 300-acre ranch. "They've lost their minds," I said, flipping through the pages. Grandpa adjusted his reading glasses, his expression unchanging as he methodically read each page. The HOA had documented 17 alleged violations, including excessive agricultural equipment visibility and livestock proximity to residential view corridors. Each violation carried penalties of $500, 0 cents per day for non-compliance. The final page contained a letter from Wellington Development, offering to solve these unfortunate compliance issues by purchasing our entire ranch for 30% below market value. "Well," Grandpa said, folding the letter precisely along its creases, "at least now we know what this is really about." That evening I drove to the county clerk's office and requested copies of all records related to our property, the annexation, and Saddleback estates. The clerk, Mrs. Dominguez, had known my family for decades. "I was wondering when one of you Stanleys would come looking," she said, leading me to a research terminal. "That Wellington fellow had his people in here for weeks, looking for any angle." 3 hours later I had my first breakthrough. The official county survey maps and the HOA claim maps didn't match, not even close. According to county records, the city annexation included a narrow strip along our eastern boundary, but the HOA was claiming nearly a quarter of our total acreage. Here's a legal trick worth knowing. Adverse possession laws in Texas may protect long-term land use against new claims. Before accepting any boundary dispute claim, always compare the accuser's maps with official county records, because sometimes the difference can save you thousands. Armed with the correct survey information, Grandpa spent the next morning installing professionally surveyed boundary markers with bright orange flags. He worked with military precision, measuring distances 3 times before securing each marker. "In Vietnam," he explained, wiping sweat from his forehead, "we learned that knowing exactly where the boundaries are could be the difference between life and death." He chuckled. "Reckon that's still true, just with different stakes." By afternoon, we had installed private property and no trespassing signs along the correct property line, citing specific Texas statutes. Grandpa also set up trail cameras disguised in trees and fence posts, positioned to monitor the boundary and the activities of our HOA visitors. Grandpa Earl spent 3 hours positioning those survey flags with military precision, muttering something about rules of engagement the entire time. For a man approaching 80, his attention to detail was extraordinary. Each flag exactly 50 feet apart, each sign perfectly level. Officer Keller's reaction came swiftly. The next morning, our trail cameras captured her systematically removing our survey markers and signs, tossing them into the back of her community standards enforcement vehicle. But she didn't stop there. New footage showed her deliberately cutting through our irrigation lines with bolt cutters, causing flooding in our lower pasture that damaged a season's worth of hay. When Grandpa confronted her with the footage of the vandalism, she denied everything and escalated her tactics. "I've documented no fewer than 24 additional violations," she said, nose buried in her clipboard. Those survey markers were improperly placed and constituted visual pollution. Perhaps you should consider selling to someone who can maintain proper standards." That same afternoon, we discovered the water had been shut off to our property. A call to the utility company revealed someone claiming to represent the property owner had requested service termination due to planned renovations. The HOA had somehow convinced the water department they had authority over our ranch. It took 3 days and an emergency hearing to get service restored, during which time we hauled water from a neighbor's well to keep our cattle alive. From that day on, Officer Keller parked directly on our boundary line, blocking access to the road we used for moving cattle and equipment. Sometimes she'd spend hours taking close-up photos through windows, our workshop, our barn, even our home. The message was clear. Nothing was private anymore. That night, I found Grandpa at the kitchen table, staring at an old photo of him and Grandma on their wedding day, the ranch house visible in the background. His hands trembled slightly, something I'd never seen before. "You know what Wellington told me at the feed store yesterday?" he said quietly. "Said a man my age shouldn't be burdened with such a large property. Said I should be looking at retirement communities, not fighting progress. Then he put his hand on my shoulder like we were old friends and said, 'Some people just don't know when it's time to give up.'" Grandpa's eyes, when they met mine, held a fire I hadn't seen since Grandma's funeral. "My daddy always said, never pick a fight, but always finish one," he told me quietly. "I'm thinking it's about time we finish this one." The next certified letter came with additional firepower, a cease and desist regarding our ranch operations. According to the HOA, our cattle's odors and noises violated Section 5.3 of the covenant. The fact that our cattle had been there for over a century, while the covenant was less than a year old, apparently didn't matter. Officer Keller now brought reinforcements, a man in khakis and a polo shirt who introduced himself as an environmental inspector. The pungent smell of cattle feed mingled with diesel exhaust as he took soil samples suspiciously close to our fuel storage area, making detailed notes while Officer Keller photographed everything. "Just routine environmental compliance verification," she explained with a thin smile. But the next day, the county environmental office called to inform us that we'd been reported for water runoff contamination, a completely fabricated claim that would require expensive testing to disprove. The situation darkened when I discovered a formal complaint had been filed with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, claiming our ranch was willfully contaminating groundwater with agricultural chemicals. The complaint named me personally as the responsible party, with potential penalties including criminal charges. The document was signed by Thomas Wellington III himself. "They're trying to drown us in paperwork and fees," I told Grandpa that evening. "And now they're trying to make me into a criminal." "Or scare you into giving up," Grandpa said grimly. "Wellington knows a young man with a corporate future can't risk a criminal record." He nodded thoughtfully, then pulled out his ancient laptop, the one he used for ranch business and not much else. "Let's see what Texas has to say about all this." Grandpa might have been slow with technology, but he was methodical. By midnight, he had compiled a comprehensive file on Texas right-to-farm laws and contacted the Agricultural Extension Office for documentation of our historical operations. Here's some knowledge worth remembering. Prior use doctrine protects agricultural operations established before residential development. Many states have right-to-farm laws that prevent newcomers from shutting down existing agricultural operations just because they don't like the normal sights, sounds, and smells of country living. The next morning, Grandpa was up before dawn, installing a heavy chain across our ranch access road with a combination lock. New signs appeared, these citing specific sections of the Texas Property Code regarding trespassing and right-to-farm protections. He sent a certified letter to the HOA documenting our 112 years of continuous agricultural use. Grandpa spent an entire afternoon positioning that chain at precisely the height of Officer Karen's hood ornament. Not that he was hoping she'd drive into it or anything. His innocent whistle as he made the final adjustments didn't fool me one bit. The HOA's response came with bolt cutters. Our security cameras caught Officer Keller cutting through our chain, claiming emergency access requirement when confronted. She now parked her SUV directly in front of our cattle loading area daily, even during scheduled livestock transport. When I politely asked her to move her vehicle so we could load cattle for a veterinary appointment, she filed a police report claiming harassment. The following week, she brought reinforcements. The HOA board president himself, a retired investment banker named Richard Harmon, who surveyed our property with the disdain of someone finding a cockroach in his country club salad. "Mr. Stanley," he said to Grandpa, his voice dripping with condescension, "this could all go away with a reasonable sale. Wellington Development has been more than generous with their offer." Grandpa leaned on his fence post, looking out over the pasture where his cattle grazed. "Did you know," he asked conversationally, "that my father hand-dug the well that waters this section? Took him 3 weeks with a shovel and a pickaxe." Harmon barely glanced at the well. "Your grandfather clearly doesn't understand modern property management," he said to me. "At his age, wouldn't it be easier to just sell and move somewhere more appropriate for seniors?" That night, we discovered someone had tampered with our cattle gate. 3 prize bulls escaped onto the road and one was hit by a car. The driver was uninjured, but our bull had to be put down. The responding sheriff's deputy found fresh paint scrapes on the gate latch, white paint matching Officer Keller's SUV. When we called the sheriff's office the next morning, we were informed that no charges would be filed due to insufficient evidence and possible ranch negligence. Later that day, we received a citation from Animal Control for livestock at large, with a $1,000 0-cent fine. Grandpa's eyes narrowed slightly as he read the citation, but his voice remained even. "Son, I may be old, but I'm not dead yet, and as long as I'm breathing, this land stays in my family." The HOA escalated matters by installing a Community Standards Enforcement Office sign at the edge of our property. The sharp metallic ping of Officer Keller's hammer driving the sign stake into our soil echoed across the pasture, each strike a deliberate claim on land that wasn't hers. Now she left her white SUV parked on our property for 8+ hours daily, a constant reminder of the invasion. One morning, she arrived with a professional photographer who spent hours documenting alleged violations for what she openly described as the upcoming court case. They left warning notices zip-tied to our equipment, our gates, even the handcrafted wooden sign that had marked Stanley Ranch since 1947. The constant stress began taking a physical toll. Grandpa's doctor called me with concerns about his rising blood pressure. Our cattle, sensitive to changes in routine, grew skittish around the loading areas where Officer Keller frequently parked. Several cows miscarried during what should have been a routine calving season. A direct result of the stress caused by constant vehicle presence and unfamiliar people. The impact spread beyond our fence line. Neighboring ranchers and farmers began stopping by, concerned about the precedent being set. The local feed store had become our war room, with farmers and ranchers stopping by with coffee and donuts to hear the latest HOA invasion updates. What started as our problem was rapidly becoming a community concern. "If they can do this to the Stanleys, who's next?" became the common refrain. The situation reached a breaking point when I returned from town to find Grandpa sitting ashen-faced on the porch steps. Wellington and Officer Keller had confronted him while I was gone, delivering what they called their final opportunity to negotiate. Wellington said if we don't accept their offer by Friday, they'll have no choice but to escalate to more direct methods, Grandpa explained, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. When I asked what that meant, Officer Keller handed me this. It was a formal notice of eminent domain proceedings, claiming the city needed our land for essential infrastructure development, specifically a water treatment facility for Saddleback Estates. The document looked official, complete with the city letterhead and what appeared to be the mayor's signature. "I called City Hall," Grandpa continued. "They know nothing about this. The signature is forged. They're trying to trick us into selling by making us think the government will take it anyway." That night, I found Grandpa in the barn at 2 a.m., methodically cleaning his old shotgun, not threatening, just methodical, as if preparing for a storm. "I'm not going to use it," he said, seeing my expression. "But my daddy taught me to be prepared. These people aren't just greedy, they're dangerous." Grandpa responded with characteristic thoroughness. He installed new security cameras with clear property line indicators, visible in the footage. He contracted a professional survey company to place official markers that required county permits to remove. A detail Officer Keller discovered when she tried to uproot one and triggered an automatic notification to the county surveyor's office. He submitted formal complaints to our county commissioner documenting each trespass with time-stamped photos and GPS coordinates. Most importantly, he began keeping a daily log of HOA presence on our property, calculating hours, activities, and estimated damages to our operation. The community response surprised even us. The local newspaper ran a front-page story titled "Heritage Ranch Faces Modern Land Grab," complete with photos of Officer Keller removing our boundary markers. 3 local ranchers volunteered to help patrol our property line. A retired sheriff's deputy began parking his truck near our gates during Officer Keller's usual inspection times, documenting her every move with his own camera. Most unexpectedly, a young couple from Saddleback Estates knocked on our door one evening. They introduced themselves as Mark and Sarah Chen, recent transplants from California who'd purchased one of the first completed homes. "We didn't move here to destroy what makes this place special," Sarah explained, handing us a USB drive. "We've been documenting the HOA meetings. They don't know we record everything." The drive contained audio recordings of Wellington openly discussing his plan to squeeze out the old rancher by any means necessary, including fabricating environmental violations and manipulating property records. The most damning recording featured Officer Keller explaining to the board how she'd successfully pressured the water department into shutting off our service by falsifying authorization documents. "My daddy taught me to never start a fight, but always finish one," Grandpa told our growing coalition of supporters as they gathered on our porch one evening. His voice carried across the darkening pasture, steady and determined. "This land fed our family through 2 world wars and the Dust Bowl. Some clipboard warrior with a tape measure isn't about to take it." The men and women around him, people who worked the land for generations, now joined by a few sympathetic Saddleback residents, nodded in solemn agreement. The battle lines were drawn, but we needed something more, something that would change the balance of power. But we had no idea that the key had been sitting in Grandpa's filing cabinet for decades. The breakthrough came by accident. I was searching through Grandpa's old files for cattle vaccination records when I found a folder labeled 1965 land sale. Inside was a yellowing deed for a small corner parcel of the original ranch that my great-grandfather had sold to the county for road expansion. What caught my eye was a clause that had been nearly forgotten. The sale included a perpetual agricultural use provision for the remaining ranch property and a specific right of access easement that followed a clearly defined 12-foot path, nowhere near where Officer Keller had been parking. "Grandpa," I called, holding the document like it was made of gold, "you need to see this." He studied the deed carefully, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. "Well, I'll be damned. Dad always said he made sure we'd be protected. Here's something crucial to remember. Deed restrictions run with the land and supersede later HOA covenants. Always search for original deed restrictions before accepting new impositions, because what was recorded 50 years ago might be your best defense today." But Grandpa wasn't finished. He disappeared into his bedroom and returned with a cardboard tube containing original engineering surveys from his days helping build county roads. The musty smell of old blueprints filled the dining room as he unfurled them on the table, their crisp blue lines revealing truth about property boundaries and water rights that had been intentionally obscured. The revelation was stunning. The annexed 6 acres included a critical drainage easement that the county had established in the 1970s. According to state law, the city could not legally transfer drainage responsibility to an HOA. Even more damning, Wellington Development had built retention ponds on misappropriated land, altering watershed patterns that affected multiple properties. "They've been playing checkers," Grandpa said, tapping the blueprints. "We've been playing chess all along and didn't even know it." But the most explosive discovery came when Mark Chen, our Saddleback Estates ally, spotted something on Wellington's signature on the drainage easement acknowledgement. "This doesn't match his current signature," Mark said, comparing documents. "The loops and slants are completely different." We had the signature analyzed by a handwriting expert who confirmed our suspicion. Wellington had forged his predecessor's signature on the acknowledgement, backdating his awareness of the drainage easement. This wasn't just an administrative oversight, it was deliberate fraud that could invalidate his permits and trigger criminal charges. That evening, Grandpa revealed another surprise. He'd been systematically collecting evidence. He produced a 3-ring binder bulging with daily photographs, all with GPS timestamps proving Officer Keller's vehicle was consistently outside the legal easement. "I've documented 172 hours of trespassing over 23 days," he said, flipping through the meticulously organized pages. Under Texas law, each day counts as a separate offense with potential damages. Turns out Grandpa's habit of documenting everything wasn't just old man paranoia after all. The 3-ring binder he produced had more details than an IRS audit: times, dates, coordinates, and photographs organized with military precision. We called Rosa Martinez, a family friend and attorney who specialized in property disputes. She arrived the next morning and spent hours reviewing our evidence, occasionally letting out a low whistle or making notes in the margins. "Earl," she said finally, looking up from the spread of documents covering our kitchen table, "you've built yourself one hell of a poker hand here. The question now is when and how to play it for maximum effect." Grandpa's eyes twinkled. "I've got some ideas about that." Word spread through the farming community like wildfire. Within days, our kitchen became headquarters for what locals started calling the ranch resistance. Weathered hands clapped Grandpa's shoulders as neighbors gathered around our kitchen table, the scent of strong coffee mingling with determination. Fifth-generation farmers sat alongside cattle ranchers, all united by a common threat. "What they're doing to Earl today, they'll do to us tomorrow," said Frank Miller, whose dairy farm bordered Saddleback Estates on the north side. "We need to make a stand." County Commissioner James Jackson, who'd gone to high school with Grandpa, provided complete records of the zoning history. The agricultural extension agent confirmed our right to farm protections in writing. Attorney Martinez drafted both a demand letter and injunction paperwork, keeping them ready for the right moment. Mark and Sarah Chen, our allies from Saddleback Estates, brought something unexpected: internal emails between Wellington and the HOA board discussing how the drainage diversion strategy would help accelerate the Stanley acquisition. The emails clearly acknowledged the drainage easement violation, with Wellington instructing board members to deny any knowledge if questioned. "We need a 3-pronged approach," Martinez explained, sketching on a legal pad: legal, engineering, and public relations. The legal strategy took shape: file for an emergency injunction against HOA enforcement actions, prepare a civil trespassing case with documented damages, and most importantly, challenge the annexation based on the drainage easement violation and document forgery. As Texas Property Code Section 202.004 specifically limits HOA powers, Martinez explained, they can't override critical infrastructure provisions. Here's a legal nugget worth its weight in gold. The easement doctrine of dominant and servient estates means an HOA can't interfere with drainage functions. Even the most powerful HOA can't override state law on critical infrastructure, like water drainage systems that affect multiple properties. While the legal team worked, Grandpa retreated to his workshop, dusting off civil engineering credentials he hadn't formally used in decades. He emerged with detailed drawings for what he called a water retention improvement project for the drainage area coincidentally located exactly where Officer Keller parked daily. But Grandpa had an additional twist to his plan. The drainage system wouldn't just create a moat around Officer Keller's parking spot, it would redirect water flow towards Saddleback Estates' improperly built retention ponds, creating a controlled demonstration of how Wellington's development had disrupted the natural watershed. "When it rains next week," Grandpa explained, pointing to the weather forecast, "the water will follow the path of least resistance, right into Wellington's undersized retention ponds. Nothing illegal about letting water flow downhill." The County Water Management District, alarmed by Wellington's unauthorized modifications to the watershed, fast-tracked approval. The county engineer reviewed Grandpa's plans and asked with a straight face if the perfectly truck-sized island in the middle of the retention pond was for wildlife habitat. Grandpa just winked and said, "Exactly." Martinez helped us calculate financial damages. We documented business losses from HOA interference, cattle stress and miscarriages, delayed shipments, veterinary expenses, property damage, and the wrongful death of our bull. Neighboring ranchers agreed to join a potential class action. We even researched tax implications. Most people don't realize this financial trick: loss of agricultural income tax deductions due to HOA reclassification can cost farmers thousands. Always quantify financial damages from harassment, because what feels like just a nuisance could could actually be calculated as substantial business interference with real monetary value. The public relations campaign developed organically. A reporter from the local newspaper caught wind of the story and contacted us about a David vs. Goliath piece. We prepared documentation for an upcoming county commissioners meeting. The Methodist Church offered their social hall for a community information session. Someone's college-age daughter created a Save Our Heritage Farm social media page that gained hundreds of followers overnight. Sarah Chen, who worked in marketing, suggested something bold, documenting the entire operation on video. People need to see this, she insisted, not just hear about it later. We need to show Wellington's tactics in real time. Throughout it all, Grandpa maintained a quiet confidence. He inspected the backhoe, checking hydraulic lines and greasing fittings. He calculated excavation volumes and soil displacement rates. He pored over property maps, marking boundaries with red pencil. "Tomorrow morning at 5 a.m. we start digging," he announced after dinner. "The HOA doesn't usually arrive until 9. By then, it'll be too late." "Are you sure about this, Grandpa?" I asked. "Once we do this, there's no going back." He looked at me steadily, the same look he'd given me when teaching me to ride a horse, brand a calf, or fix a tractor. "In engineering, son, there's a saying, water always wins." It's time HOAkaren learned that lesson. The operation began in darkness. The rumble of the backhoe's diesel engine in the pre-dawn darkness broke the morning silence. Headlights cutting through mist as Grandpa executed his plan with military precision. 3 neighboring ranchers arrived to help, bringing additional equipment and supplies. Survey stakes marked the exact boundaries of our property, ensuring every scoop of dirt remained on our land. Mark Chen set up cameras on tripods, documenting the entire process from multiple angles. "For the record," he explained with a grin, "Sarah directed the filming, occasionally providing whispered commentary that sounded remarkably professional." The excavation followed the approved drainage plan exactly. A 6-foot-wide trench, 4 feet deep, designed to capture runoff from the higher pasture. The only unusual feature was that the trench formed a perfect circle around Officer Keller's usual parking spot, leaving an island of undisturbed ground approximately the size of her SUV. Grandpa installed a weatherproof sign on a post in the middle of the island. "Official Wildlife Observation Point, Protected Habitat, Do Not Disturb." Below it, in smaller letters, HOAkaren Study Area, Endangered Species Monitoring. By 8:30 a.m. the trenches were complete. A small pump powered by a portable generator began filling them with water from our stock pond. Commissioner Jackson arrived, coincidentally, to inspect the project, nodding approvingly at the careful work. "Looks like a textbook water management system, Earl," he said loudly enough for the workers to hear. "Good to see you taking watershed protection seriously." At precisely 9:22 IEM, right on her usual schedule, Officer Keller's white SUV appeared on the horizon. She parked in her regular spot, seemingly oblivious to the newly constructed water feature surrounding her vehicle. With clipboard in hand, she marched toward our barn, likely planning another day of violations documentation. The confusion on her face when she returned 40 minutes later was worth every drop of sweat the project had cost. She stood at the edge of the trench, staring in disbelief at her vehicle, now stranded on a small island in the middle of what appeared to be a moat. HOAkaren's face cycled through more colors than a Texas sunset as she realized what had happened. Her voice reached a pitch that had nearby dogs howling in sympathy as she pulled out her phone and frantically dialed. "This is Officer Keller. I need police at the Stanley Ranch immediately. They've vandalized county property and engaged in criminal mischief. I want them arrested, all of them." Grandpa stood calmly on our porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the scene unfold. When Officer Keller attempted to drive across the trench, her front wheels slid into the muddy water, leaving her vehicle tilted at a precarious angle, tires spinning uselessly. Sheriff Rodriguez arrived 30 minutes later, taking in the scene with the measured calm of a man who'd seen everything in his 20 years of law enforcement. He reviewed our property boundaries, examined the approved drainage plans, and spoke briefly with Commissioner Jackson. "Ma'am," he said to Officer Keller, who was demanding Grandpa's immediate arrest, "I understand you're upset, but this appears to be an approved drainage project on private property. I suggest you call a tow truck with a really long hook." "This is deliberate sabotage," she sputtered. "They trapped my vehicle." The sheriff looked pointedly at the no trespassing signs. The way I see it, you parked on clearly marked private property at your own risk. Mr. Stanley has documentation showing this water management project was approved last week. You might want to check with your office about notification procedures. Just as the confrontation reached its peak, the weather forecast proved accurate. Dark clouds gathered, and a sudden cloudburst turned the light rain into a downpour. Water began flowing through Grandpa's carefully engineered channels, not just around Officer Keller's stranded vehicle, but toward the lower portion of the property that bordered Saddleback Estates. Within an hour, Wellington's undersized retention ponds began overflowing, sending sheets of water cascading through the backyards of 3 Saddleback homes. Not enough to cause serious damage, but more than enough to demonstrate the development's drainage flaws. Mark Chen, who had strategically positioned waterproof cameras, captured the entire sequence in high definition. The HOA's response was swift and furious. An emergency board meeting was called that afternoon, with Thomas Wellington III in attendance. Through community connections, we learned he'd been livid, pounding the table and demanding immediate action against that crazy old man. The board authorized legal action against our family, hiring private security to monitor the property line 24/7. Wellington's parting words, overheard by the board secretary and relayed to us, revealed his true intentions. This old man thinks he's clever, but I've broken tougher nuts than him. By the time I'm done, he'll be lucky to keep his house, let alone his precious ranch. That evening, as Officer Keller's vehicle was finally extracted by a specialized tow truck at her personal expense, Grandpa installed a new sign at the edge of the moat. HOAkaren Memorial Lake, dedicated to those who don't understand property lines. By morning, photos of the sign had gone viral on local social media. He had no idea what was coming. The legal assault hit like a Texas thunderstorm, sudden and overwhelming. 3 separate court filings landed within days. An emergency injunction from the HOA claiming malicious obstruction, a civil suit from Wellington Development alleging nuisance interference with business, and a personal lawsuit from Officer Keller claiming emotional distress and professional defamation. The heavy thud of the court summons hitting our kitchen table seemed to vibrate with malice. 3 separate court dates within 2 weeks, requiring 3 separate legal responses and potentially 3 separate legal teams. A strategy designed to drain our resources and fracture our defense. Grandpa remained remarkably calm, following Attorney Martinez's advice to the letter. While she filed our counterclaim for trespassing, complete with our compiled evidence, Grandpa submitted the drainage easement documentation to the court. We temporarily moved our cattle operation to the far side of the property, away from the disputed boundary. Grandpa kept humming the battle hymn of the Republic while reviewing legal papers, occasionally chuckling and saying checkmate to no one in particular. For a man facing multiple lawsuits that threatened his ancestral property, he seemed almost cheerful. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Local farmers brought equipment to help with the cattle move. The church prayer group organized a support schedule, ensuring someone was always at the ranch to document any HOA actions. The agricultural co-op passed a formal resolution supporting our family and condemning predatory development practices. Our unexpected allies from Saddleback Estates proved invaluable. After the drainage demonstration had sent water flowing into several backyards, more homeowners began questioning Wellington's construction practices. When 3 homeowners discovered water seepage in their basements, they hired an independent inspector who confirmed substandard drainage systems throughout the development. Mark Chen's video of Officer Keller's Moat incident had been uploaded to YouTube with the title, HOA Officer Gets Geography Lesson from Texas Rancher. Within 48 hours, it had over 50,000 views and was being shared on multiple social media platforms. Comments ranged from outraged support for our cause to hilarious memes featuring Officer Keller's stranded vehicle. Neighboring ranchers filed affidavits about HOA overreach on their own properties, transforming our individual fight into a community stand. When Wellington's legal team attempted to depose 5 local farmers, 20 showed up at the courthouse in solidarity, overwhelming the small facility. Here's a financial strategy worth remembering. Community mutual aid agreements provide legal financial protection against frivolous lawsuits. Building strong community relationships isn't just good neighborliness. It can become critical legal and financial support when corporations try to isolate and pressure individual landowners. Wellington's desperation became apparent when Sarah Chen forwarded us an email accidentally sent to all Saddleback residents instead of just the board. In it, Wellington acknowledged significant legal vulnerabilities regarding the drainage easement and suggested they might need to explore a strategic settlement before the forgery issue becomes public. While we prepared our defense, unexpected support came from the county government. Commissioner Jackson ordered a comprehensive review of the annexation process, uncovering troubling irregularities. Wellington Development had significantly misrepresented their drainage plans in the original submissions. The environmental impact study requirements had been mysteriously waived. Most damning, the retention pond construction had violated no fewer than 7 watershed protection ordinances. Then came the masterstroke. A retired county clerk, Mrs. Dominguez's predecessor, came forward with evidence that Wellington had submitted 2 different versions of the annexation proposal, one to the public and county commissioners showing minimal impact on surrounding properties, and a different internal version revealing plans to acquire adjoining farms through forced annexation and code enforcement. This whole annexation looks increasingly suspect, Commissioner Jackson told reporters during an impromptu press conference. We may need to revisit not just the Stanley Ranch portion, but the entire approval process. The commissioner's statement sent shockwaves through Saddleback Estates. Property owners who'd purchased homes under the assumption of proper permits and approvals began asking uncomfortable questions. The local newspaper ran a front-page story titled, "Development Drainage Disaster. Who approved this?" Wellington responded by accelerating construction on the remaining lots and stepping up marketing efforts. The HOA board, increasingly nervous about potential liability, began distancing themselves from Officer Keller's more aggressive tactics. Documents later revealed they'd held an emergency session debating whether to drop their claims against our family, but Wellington had threatened to sue the board personally if they backed down. The turning point came when Commissioner Jackson called for an emergency public hearing to address the significant public safety concerns regarding watershed management at Saddleback Estates. All parties would be required to present evidence in the county courthouse before the full commission with media present. That evening, a new sign appeared beside HOAkaren Memorial Lake. This one reading, "Wellington's Watergate, where development corruption runs downhill." By morning, both signs had been photographed by the local newspaper. The stage was set for a final confrontation. The county courthouse hadn't seen a crowd like this in decades. Farmers and ranchers in freshly pressed shirts and polished boots filled the public seating. Saddleback residents, increasingly concerned about their property values and the integrity of their homes, occupied another section. Local media set up cameras in the designated area, while reporters from regional outlets jostled for position. A tense silence fell as Grandpa Earl walked to the podium, his boots echoing on the hardwood floor. The subtle nods of support from dozens of weathered faces in the audience seemed to strengthen his posture. At 78, facing an army of corporate lawyers, he looked remarkably composed in his best blue suit and bolo tie. Wellington presented first, flanked by attorneys and HOA board members. His community improvement presentation featured glossy renderings of expanded Saddleback Estates, complete with hiking trails and man-made lakes, all conveniently extending onto portions of our ranch. The Stanley family is clinging to outdated ways at the expense of hundreds of new homeowners, Wellington declared, gesturing to charts showing projected tax revenues. Their stubbornness is costing this county millions in tax revenue and new development opportunities. We've offered a more than generous settlement that would allow them to relocate comfortably. The HOA attorney followed with a methodical presentation of our alleged violations, from fence heights to equipment storage to livestock management practices. The settlement offer, now increased to 40% below market value, was presented as an act of extraordinary generosity. Officer Keller took the stand next, dramatically recounting her traumatizing experience of being deliberately trapped on our property. She claimed to suffer nightmares and anxiety attacks since the incident, requiring medication and therapy. Her attorney displayed enlarged photos of the moat, the offensive signage, and her stranded vehicle, describing the entire setup as a malicious trap designed to humiliate a public servant. When Grandpa's turn came, he approached the podium with a single manila folder. He thanked the commissioners for their time and the community for their support. Then, with the patience of a man who had weathered many storms, he began telling the story of our family's stewardship of the land. My grandfather hand-dug the well that still waters our south pasture. My father pioneered rotational grazing practices that preserved topsoil during the worst drought in Texas history. And I implemented watershed management techniques that benefit not just our ranch, but every property downstream, including what's now Saddleback Estates. Grandpa adjusted his glasses with the deliberate slowness of a man about to show his royal flush after everyone else has gone all in. From his folder, he produced enlarged trail camera photos showing Officer Keller removing survey markers and trespassing signs. A time-lapse video compilation demonstrated the HOA's systematic encroachment over 3 weeks. The audience murmured as he presented the original drainage easement documents, with Wellington's own signature acknowledging the restrictions before development began. "And now," Grandpa said, his voice steady, "I'd like to introduce Mark and Sarah Chen, residents of Saddleback Estates, who have evidence that may interest this commission." The young couple approached the podium, carrying a laptop and portable speaker. The audio recordings of Wellington discussing how to squeeze out the old rancher echoed through the suddenly silent courtroom. Wellington's face drained of color as his own voice clearly stated, "If we can't buy him out legally, we'll find other ways to get him off that land." Attorney Martinez explained the multiple violations of Texas property law, noting that Wellington's own engineers had certified awareness of the drainage easement in their initial permits. Here's a legal protection everyone should know. Slander of title claims can hold developers liable for misrepresenting property boundaries. Documentation isn't just defensive, it can become your strongest offensive weapon when presented properly in the right public forum. The county engineer's testimony proved devastating. Using Grandpa's original surveys and recent drone footage, he confirmed that Wellington's development had significantly altered protected watershed patterns. The retention ponds, centerpieces of Saddleback's marketing materials, had been constructed in direct violation of state environmental regulations. These modifications have created a potential flood risk that wasn't present before development, he explained, pointing to simulation models. The natural drainage patterns that protected this area for decades have been compromised. Sheriff Rodriguez acknowledged the multiple documented cases of criminal trespass, noting that his department had issued verbal warnings that were repeatedly ignored. But the true bombshell came when Martinez presented the forensic handwriting analysis, proving Wellington had forged signatures on critical drainage documents. The retired county clerk testified about the 2 different versions of the annexation proposal, and Mrs. Dominguez presented evidence that property records had been improperly altered after approval. As Wellington frantically whispered to his attorneys, Commissioner Jackson revealed that the State Environmental Protection Agency had opened an investigation into the annexation irregularities, with potential penalties that could halt all further construction. Wellington's face darkened with each revelation. When he attempted to interrupt, the commission chairman firmly cut him off. "Mr. Wellington, you'll have your chance to respond after all evidence is presented." The most powerful moment came when one Saddleback homeowner after another stood to describe water damage, foundation cracks, and drainage problems, issues Wellington's company had dismissed as normal settling. 27 homeowners had discovered their properties were built on improperly prepared soil, with corners cut on virtually every aspect of construction. When Grandpa returned to the podium for closing remarks, the room fell completely silent. His voice, strengthened by decades of calling cattle and giving orders over tractor engines, carried to every corner. "I've spent 78 years learning that you don't have to be the biggest dog in the fight if you're the smartest," he said, looking directly at Wellington. "This land was here long before any HOA, and with proper stewardship it'll be here long after they're gone. We're not selling, not today, not tomorrow, not ever." The sharp crack of the commissioner's gavel closing the matter seemed to release months of tension from Grandfather's shoulders. His testimony had landed like a thunderclap, echoing through the packed courthouse. Wellington's legal team huddled in urgent whispers, while the HOA board members stared at their shoes, suddenly fascinated by the floor tiles. 11. Resolution plus Epilogue 740/700. The official ruling came down like sweet summer rain after a drought. The county commission voted unanimously to rescind the partial annexation of our ranch. They ordered Wellington Development to rectify all drainage violations within 90 days, or face daily fines that would make even a millionaire developer wince. The sheriff issued a formal criminal trespass warning to all HOA personnel, requiring written permission before setting foot on Stanley Ranch property again. Most satisfyingly, the judge dismissed all HOA claims against our family, citing bad faith and improper jurisdictional claims. 2 weeks later, the district attorney opened a formal investigation into Wellington's document forgery and fraud. Officer Keller became a cooperating witness, revealing that Wellington had directed her to target our ranch specifically. Her testimony secured her immunity, but ended her HOA career. The ripple effect spread quickly through the community. The HOA board removed Officer Keller from enforcement duties, reassigning her to administrative functions away from public contact. Wellington Development modified their building plans to respect not just our boundaries, but those of all adjacent agricultural properties. The county adopted new protections for heritage farms, requiring enhanced notifications and impact studies before any annexation affecting properties with over 50 years of continuous operation. Most surprisingly, a state representative from our district introduced the Heritage Farm Protection Act in the legislature, using our case as a primary example of why such protections were needed. Mark and Sarah Chen's video documentation proved invaluable. The HOAkaren Gets Moated video reached 2 million views on YouTube, with comments from HOA victims across the country calling Grandpa a tactical genius and the rural resistance leader we need. The footage of Wellington's retention ponds overflowing into saddleback yards became key evidence in a class action lawsuit filed by homeowners against the development company. Grandpa pretended to be embarrassed by the attention, but I caught him scrolling through comments one evening, chuckling at particularly colorful descriptions of Officer Keller's reaction. He'd taken to wearing a t-shirt around the ranch that read, "Moat Builder in Chief," a gift from the local feed store. But the real victory wasn't in humiliating the HOA or defeating Wellington. It came in what Grandpa did next. Using his renewed energy and community goodwill, Grandfather established the Agricultural Heritage Education Program, opening a portion of our ranch for tours where Saddleback Estates children could learn about farming, ranching, and land stewardship. The same kids whose parents had once complained about agricultural odors now begged to help feed calves and collect eggs. The program expanded when 6 neighboring farms joined, creating the Heritage Farm Trail that became a popular weekend destination. The moat itself was transformed into a proper pond, stocked with fish and featuring a covered observation deck where visitors could learn about watershed management and sustainable agriculture. A small sign remained, inspired by HOAkaren, "Sometimes it takes a moat to build a bridge." Grandpa created a scholarship for agricultural engineering students at the local community college, with preference given to those focusing on sustainable water management, his specialty and passion. Most surprising to everyone, he donated 5 acres of land for a community farmers market where both ranch families and Saddleback residents could gather every Saturday morning. The financial strategy he employed deserves attention. Conservation easements provide significant tax benefits while protecting land from future development. Strategic generosity can build stronger protection for your property than any fence by creating community investment in preserving your way of life. The transformation in our lives was remarkable. Grandpa's blood pressure returned to normal levels without medication. Our family bonds, strengthened through adversity, grew deeper than ever. New friendships formed with neighbors, including several Saddleback residents who became regular visitors and supporters. Even our ranch operations improved through the knowledge sharing that happened during community events. The highlight came when the Heritage Farm Festival was established as an annual event, drawing thousands to celebrate agricultural traditions. At the inaugural festival, Grandpa was presented with the Clearwater Stewardship Award, which now hangs proudly in our living room alongside a framed photograph of Officer Keller's stranded SUV. One evening, as the setting sun painted the pastures gold, Grandpa and I sat on the porch swing, watching cattle graze peacefully in the distance. "Sometimes it takes nearly losing something to remember why it's worth fighting for," he said quietly. "This land isn't just dirt and grass. It's our heritage, our future. And now," he chuckled, "thanks to a well-placed moat, it's a symbol of standing up to bullies everywhere." I nodded, understanding that his victory had never been about revenge, but about protection. of the land, our way of life, and the promise I'd made to my grandmother to preserve our family legacy. Have you ever faced an HOA nightmare? Share your story in the comments below. We've found that shining light on these situations often helps others find solutions to their own property battles. And if you enjoyed this tale of rural justice, hit subscribe for more true stories of ordinary people outsmarting the system. Next week, hospital tried charging us $18,000, 0 cents, for aspirin, so my accountant wife audited their entire billing department.